Ever felt like your boss was a lunatic? Well, history's kings were worse. They had armies to back up their madness. We're talking about rulers who didn't just make bad decisions, they turned their weirdest hallucinations into national laws. From taxing the hair on your face to declaring war on the moon, these are the 50 most absurd rules ever enforced. If you think modern politics is a circus, you haven't seen anything yet. Welcome to the theater of the elite and insane. 1. King Henry VIII of England once looked at his reflection and decided that facial hair was a taxable luxury, effectively turning every beard into a subscription service for the crown. It wasn't just a flat fee. The tax was graduated based on the owner's social standing, meaning the wealthier you were, the more you paid for the privilege of not shaving. Imagine checking your bank balance before deciding to skip a morning trim just to avoid a government fine. If you were a bearded man in Tudor England, would you have paid the fee to keep your rugged look? Or would you have surrendered to the razor to save your coins? 2. Imagine being so convinced you were made of fragile glass that you banned anyone from touching you. This was the daily reality for King Charles VI of France. Known as Charles the Mad, he had special reinforced clothing made with iron ribs sewn into the fabric to act as a protective cage against accidental shattering. He would sit perfectly still for hours, terrified that a clumsy servant or a stray breeze might result in his literal disintegration. It is incredibly hard to run a medieval kingdom when you are genuinely worried that a high five from a general might be a lethal weapon. 3. Emperor Honorius of the Western Roman Empire was so obsessed with his pet chicken named Roma that when a messenger arrived to tell him that the city of Rome had been sacked, he reportedly burst into tears. However, his grief wasn't for the thousands of people or the fall of the empire. He cried because he thought his chicken had died. When the messenger clarified that it was the city that had fallen, he sighed in relief and said, "But I thought my bird Roma had perished." It's a chilling example of a ruler whose world was so small that a single poultry pet mattered more than the greatest civilization in history. Does a leader's lack of empathy for the masses make them more or less capable of making hard decisions? 4. Sultan Selim II, also known as Selim the Sot, once became so obsessed with a specific type of vintage wine from Cyprus that he basically launched a full-scale invasion just to secure the vineyards. He reportedly told his commander that because he loved the wine so much, the island now legally belonged to him, triggering a massive conflict that changed the map of the Mediterranean. He essentially started a war because he didn't want to wait for shipping and handling on his favorite bottle. Is there any drink or food on earth you'd be willing to go to war over? 5. Have you ever met a king who was also a professional-grade pickpocket? King Farouk of Egypt turned his royal status into a license to steal whatever caught his eye, even from world leaders. During a high-stakes meeting with Winston Churchill, the king actually managed to lift the British Prime Minister's pocket watch right off his person without him noticing. When Churchill realized it was gone, Farouk simply laughed and handed it back, claiming he had found it. He even took formal lessons from a professional thief to sharpen his skills, which is a very strange career pivot for a reigning monarch. 6. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire once developed a legal obsession with the weight of his subjects, specifically his harem. He passed a mandate that his officials must find the heaviest woman in the empire to become his new favorite, leading to a nationwide search that treated body weight like a high-stakes Olympic competition. The winner was a woman weighing over 330 pounds, who was given a massive salary and her own palace, proving that royal beauty standards can change as quickly as a king's mood. It's a strange reminder that in the eyes of a monarch, even your physical stats can be a matter of national importance. 7. Queen Maria I of Portugal suffered from a fear so intense that she banned church bells from being rung anywhere near her residence, fearing they were a direct signal from the afterlife. Her anxiety eventually evolved into a total ban on many forms of public noise, turning the royal court into a place of hushed whispers and tiptoeing servants. Living under her rule meant you were constantly one loud sneeze away from being accused of treason against the queen's delicate ears. Do you think a leader's personal phobias should ever have the power to change the laws of a whole country? 8. Empress Wu Zetian of China, the only woman to ever officially rule as emperor, passed a law that required all high-ranking officials to pay respects to her favorite pet parrot. She claimed the bird was a divine messenger and used it as a lie detector during court sessions. If the parrot squawked while an official was speaking, she would claim the bird knew they were lying. It was a brilliant, albeit insane, way to maintain control by using a colorful bird as the ultimate judge of character. How would you handle a job interview where your future depended entirely on the mood of a tropical bird? 9. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king, nearly bankrupted his state to build dreamlike castles where he lived out a total fantasy life. He didn't just build them. His internal royal laws required his servants to treat his invisible dinner guests, including long-dead French kings, with the same respect as a visiting emperor. He lived in a world of Wagnerian operas and imaginary friends, often dining alone while talking to empty chairs. While he was eventually deposed for his insanity, his architectural obsessions left us with the castle that inspired the iconic Disney logo. 10. Emperor Caligula is the gold standard for royal madness, once famously declaring that his favorite horse, Incitatus, was to be appointed as a priest and a consul of Rome. He provided the horse with a marble stall, an ivory manger, and a collar made of precious stones, then legally required dignitaries to dine with the stallion. This wasn't just about being an animal lover. It was a calculated insult to the Roman Senate to prove Caligula believed a horse was more competent than the politicians. If your government was replaced by a team of well-groomed horses tomorrow, do you think things would actually get better or worse? 11. King Christian VII of Denmark was so obsessed with the concept of street brawling that he actually legalized public fistfighting, provided it was done for sport, and followed his very specific chaotic rules. He was known to leap out of his royal carriage to join random street fights, dragging his terrified courtiers into the fray while screaming at the top of his lungs. The king essentially turned his entire capital into a real-life fight club, where the monarch was the most unpredictable combatant. If you were walking home from work and the king of your country suddenly tried to punch you in the face, would you hit back or just take the royal bruising for the sake of your neck? 12. While most leaders worry about taxes or borders, King Nzinga of Ndongo took a much more personal approach to legislation by banning any man from sitting in a chair in her presence. If a meeting required sitting, the queen would force one of her male servants to get on all fours and act as a human stool for the duration of the negotiations. This wasn't just a power move. It was a legally enforced hierarchy designed to remind every visiting diplomat exactly who held the literal and figurative upper hand. It's hard to negotiate a peace treaty when your primary concern is maintaining your balance on a subordinate's lower back. 13. Imagine a law that bans you from being too sad. This was the reality under Emperor Domitian of Rome, who passed a decree making it illegal for the public to mourn anyone he had executed. He believed that crying for his victims was a direct criticism of his judgment, so he mandated that the families of the deceased must appear in public with smiles and festive clothing immediately after a funeral. If you were caught shedding a single tear for a traitor, you were legally considered a traitor yourself. It is the ultimate form of emotional gaslighting, where the state literally owns your grief. 14. Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China was so deeply terrified of death that he made it a capital offense to even mention the word dying in his presence. He spent a significant portion of the national budget on immortality quests, sending thousands of people out into the ocean to find a mythical elixir that didn't exist. If a scholar suggested that the emperor might eventually, stop breathing, they were promptly executed to prove a point about positivity. He essentially tried to legislate his way out of biology, proving that even the most powerful man on Earth can't fire the Grim Reaper. 15. King James I of England harbored a hatred for tobacco so visceral that he wrote a whole book against it, and then effectively legalized its extinction by raising the import tax by a staggering 4,000%. He didn't just want it regulated. He wanted it to be so expensive that only the ultra-wealthy could afford a single puff. He described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and harmful to the brain, making him history's first and most aggressive anti-smoking lobbyist. Could you imagine the modern world if every minor annoyance of a world leader resulted in a 4,000% price hike overnight? 16. Queen Ranavalona. Eye of Madagascar, often called the Mad Queen, decided that the best way to determine a person's guilt or innocence was the Tangina ordeal. This legally mandated trial involved the suspect eating 3 pieces of chicken skin, followed by a toxic nut that induced violent vomiting. If they puked up all 3 pieces of skin, they were innocent. If they died or failed to produce the skins, they were guilty, and their property was seized by the crown. It was essentially a legal system based entirely on the structural integrity of your stomach lining. Does this sound more or like less fair than our current jury system? 17. King Alexander of Greece once passed a decree that was essentially a declaration of war against the local wildlife, specifically targeting the monkeys in the royal gardens. He was famously bitten by a domestic Barbary macaque while trying to break up a fight between his dog and another monkey, and the resulting infection actually killed him. Before his death, he had ordered several retaliatory measures against the primate population, proving that even a king can be taken down by a grumpy mammal in his own backyard. It's a stark reminder that nature doesn't care about your royal lineage or your expensive crown. 18. In the 18th century, King Frederick William I of Prussia became so obsessed with height that he created the Potsdam Giants, a regiment of soldiers who had to be at least 6 feet tall. To fill the ranks, he passed laws allowing his agents to literally kidnap tall men from other countries and force them into his toy army. He even attempted to breed taller humans by forcing his giant soldiers to marry exceptionally tall women, essentially trying to engineer a master race of super guards via royal decree. If you were 6'5" in 1720, you weren't a basketball star. You were a target for a Prussian kidnapping squad. 19. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome was famous for his dinner laws, which dictated that guests at his banquets had to endure prank punishments based on his whims. He once legally required his guests to sit on air cushions that servants would slowly deflate during the meal, leaving the dignified senators sprawling on the floor. At other times, he would release tame lions and leopards into the dining room just to watch his terrified friends scramble for the exits. He treated the highest office in the world like a high-budget YouTube prank channel, but with the added risk of being mauled by a big cat for a punchline. 20. King Gustav III of Sweden was so convinced that coffee was a lethal poison that he turned a pair of twins into a lifelong science experiment to prove his point. He commuted the death sentences of 2 brothers on the condition that one drank 3 pots of tea a day and the other drank 3 pots of coffee for the rest of their lives. He even appointed 2 doctors to monitor their inevitable demise. But the king was assassinated long before the experiment ended. Ironically, the coffee drinker outlived the tea drinker and both doctors, making the king's science-based law a total failure. 21. King Charles II of Spain was the product of so much royal inbreeding that his jaw was legally protected, not because it was a treasure, but because he literally couldn't chew. He passed a decree stating that the royal food must be served as a liquid mash because the king's majesty shouldn't be insulted by the sight of him struggling with a crust of bread. His tongue was so large that his speech was nearly unintelligible, yet his every garbled mumble was treated as a divine law that the entire court had to interpret and obey. 22. Peter the Great of Denmark's neighbor once decided that the sun was his personal property and attempted to tax the windows of his subjects. This window tax meant that if you wanted more light in your house, you had to pay the crown for every single pane of glass you owned. People got so fed up with this daylight robbery that they began bricking up their windows, leading to an era of dark, damp, and depressing homes just to spite the king's greed. It's one thing to tax income, but imagine having to pay a monthly subscription fee just to see the sun from your living room. 23. King George III of the United Kingdom, during a bout of mental instability, reportedly tried to mandate that every sentence spoken in his presence end with the word peacock. While his advisors usually managed to bury his most absurd official decrees, The court was often forced to indulge his delusions to keep the peace and avoid royal tantrums. It makes you wonder how different global history would look if the Declaration of Independence had to be negotiated while everyone sounded like they were obsessed with tropical birds. 24. In a fit of architectural ego, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon mandated that every single brick used in the construction of the city walls be stamped with his personal name and title. This wasn't just for show, it was a legal requirement that turned the entire city into a massive, clay-baked advertisement for his greatness. Thousands of years later, archaeologists are still finding his business card in every shovel of dirt, proving that he successfully spammed the future with his ego. If every brick in your house had the president's name on it, would you feel safe or just annoyed? 25. King James IV of Scotland had a bizarre obsession with the natural language of humans and passed a law to conduct a horrific linguistic experiment. He sent 2 young children to be raised in total isolation on the island of Inchkeith, accompanied only by a mute nurse, to see what language they would speak without outside influence. He claimed they eventually began speaking perfect Hebrew, though most historians think he just made that up to sound more pious. It's a terrifying example of a king using actual children as lab rats for his own curiosity. Does a crown give someone the right to play God with a child's mind? 26. Sultan Ibrahim II of the Ottoman Empire, affectionately nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad, developed a specific and wildly expensive obsession with sables and perfumes. He passed a law requiring the city's wealthiest merchants to donate their most precious fabrics and scents, just so he could line the walls of his entire imperial palace with fur. He essentially treated the national treasury like a personal credit card, with no limit and a very eccentric shopping list. His whims were as dangerous as they were expensive, once ordering his entire harem to be drowned based on a single unverified rumor. 27. Queen Juana of Castile, famously known as Juana the Mad, took her marriage vows way too literally by passing a law that her husband's corpse must travel with her everywhere she went. For years, she refused to let him be buried, keeping his coffin in her room and occasionally opening it to kiss his decaying feet. She even mandated that no woman, other than herself, could get near the coffin, fearing her dead husband might somehow cheat on her from beyond the grave. It's the ultimate till death do us part loophole. How far is too far when it comes to royal grieving? 28. King Baodong Paya of Burma was so convinced he was the next Buddha that he passed a law requiring all the monks in his kingdom to recognize him as a divine being. When the monks pointed out that he was actually a very violent and worldly king, he responded by threatening to execute anyone who didn't include him in their prayers. He spent the national treasury building a massive pagoda that he never finished, essentially trying to buy his way into heaven with other people's money and labor. If a leader declared themselves a god tomorrow, would you bow down or start the protest? 29. King Henry IV of France had such a notorious problem with body odor that he reportedly passed a law, or royal etiquette, that no one was allowed to complain about his smell in his presence. He was known to smell so strongly of garlic and old sweat that his own mistress famously fainted when he entered the room. Because he was the king, everyone had to pretend he smelled like a field of lilies while their eyes were literally watering from the fumes. 30. Emperor Justinian II of the Byzantine Empire had a law that was as vengeful as a movie plot. After his nose was cut off and he was exiled, he fought his way back to the throne and wore a nose made of solid gold. He then passed a decree that for every minute he spent having his golden nose polished, one of his former enemies had to be executed. He turned his morning grooming routine into a literal death sentence for those who had wronged him. 31. King Charles II of England had a fascination with the royal touch, a belief that his mere physical contact could cure scrofula, a nasty skin disease. He didn't just suggest this, he turned it into a massive, legally structured public event where he touched over 90,000 people during his reign. Each patient received a gold coin strung on a white ribbon, which the king had to personally place around their necks. It was essentially a state-sponsored miracle tour that cost the treasury a fortune in gold medals. Imagine a world where your healthcare plan was just waiting in a 3-mile line for a king to poke you in the face and give you a souvenir. 32. King Ludwig XV of France had a very specific, legally enforced rule for his private suppers. No one was allowed to talk about politics, religion, or anything remotely heavy. He created a set of laws of conversation that mandated only light, witty, and flirtatious banter was permitted at the dinner table. If a guest accidentally brought up a serious national crisis, they were immediately ghosted from the royal social circle. It's like living in a world where the comment section is permanently set to positive vibes only, even while the country is falling apart. 33. Emperor Nero once decided that his true calling wasn't ruling Rome, but becoming a world-class Olympic athlete and musician. To ensure he never lost, he passed a law that any contest he entered had to crown him the winner, regardless of his actual performance. During one chariot race, he famously fell out of his carriage and didn't even finish the course. Yet the judges, terrified for their lives, still declared him the champion. He returned to Rome with over 3,800 crowns, essentially gaslighting the entire Mediterranean into believing he was a sporting god. If you won every game you played by default, would you eventually get bored or just more arrogant? 34. King Afonso VI of Portugal was so paranoid about being assassinated in his sleep that he turned his bedroom into a legal fortress where no one was allowed to enter, even his wife. He slept surrounded by a pack of feral dogs and kept several loaded pistols under his pillow at all times. His security laws were so extreme that even the highest-ranking ministers had to shout through a heavy oak door to get him to sign any legislation. He effectively ran a global empire from under his bedsheets while his dogs growled at anyone who dared to knock. 35. In 18th century Prussia, King Frederick William IV took workplace productivity to a terrifying level by banning his subjects from playing any kind of games during their breaks. He believed that leisure was a sin against the state and passed a decree that anyone caught playing cards or dice would be sentenced to hard labor. He even sent morality patrols through the streets to listen for the sound of laughter or gambling coming from private homes. He wanted his people to be as cold and efficient as the gears in a clock, proving that some rulers see their citizens as nothing more than biological machinery. 36. In a move that feels like a modern corporate rebranding gone wrong, King Rama VI of Siam mandated that all his subjects adopt Western-style surnames and specific hairstyles. This wasn't a suggestion. Officials were sent out to ensure families picked names that sounded civilized, according to the king's personal, highly westernized tastes. He even dictated the exact length of women's hair, effectively becoming the nation's head stylist. It's one thing for a king to manage the borders, but managing the contents of everyone's hair salon is a whole different level of micromanagement. 37. King George I of Great Britain had a very specific rule about his household staff. They were forbidden from speaking English in his presence. Despite being the King of England, he was German and refused to learn the language of his subjects, so he mandated that all royal business be conducted in Latin or French. This meant that British ministers often had to fumble through ancient Latin phrases, just to tell the king the country was running out of money. It's like having a boss who refuses to use email and insists you only communicate via carrier pigeon and Morse code. 38. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire once became so obsessed with the color of his own beard that he passed a law requiring all the men in his inner circle to dye their facial hair with a specific, expensive henna. If the shade didn't match the sultan's imperial glow, the offender was banished from the palace until their beard grew back in a more acceptable hue. He viewed his court as a living canvas where he was the only artist allowed to pick the palette. It's one thing to have a dress code, but it's a whole different level of madness when your employer dictates the literal chemistry of your hair follicles. 39. King Louis XVI of France once passed a potato law because his people were starving but refused to eat potatoes, which they thought were pig food or poisonous. To trick them, he planted a royal potato patch and legally mandated that it be guarded by elite soldiers 24/7, making the crop look incredibly valuable. He then told the guards to accidentally leave their posts at night so locals would steal the royal vegetables. It was a rare case of a weird law being used for a good cause, using reverse psychology and the law to save a nation from a famine. 40. In 1948, the silence in Yemen was legally mandated by King Yahya, who decided the best way to protect traditional values was to ban all modern music. This wasn't just about radio broadcasts. Even humming a catchy tune in the street could land you in serious trouble with the religious police. He viewed melody as a gateway to moral decay, creating a nation that functioned like a very depressing silent movie where no one was allowed to sing. Could you survive even a single week in a world where your favorite playlist was considered a high-level criminal offense? 41. King Philip IV of France once decided that his own spiritual debt was a national emergency, so he effectively legalized the mass robbery of the Knights Templar. He passed a series of secret decrees that allowed the state to arrest every single member of the order on the same day, claiming they were all heretics who practiced bizarre rituals. The law was essentially a giant reset button for the king's bank account, as he seized their vast gold reserves to fund his own wars. It's the ultimate historical example of a ruler using the legal system to commit a heist against his own creditors. 42. In a display of botanical ego, King Farouk of Egypt passed a law that all private cars in the country had to be painted red, because red was the color of the royal family. This meant that no ordinary citizen could own a red vehicle, effectively making the color a symbol of "get out of my way." If you were caught driving a crimson sedan, the police would treat it as if you were impersonating the king himself. He basically turned an entire color into a trademarked royal property, proving that when you have a crown, even the rainbow has to follow your rules. 43. King Charles III of Norway and Sweden was so terrified of the medical profession that he passed a law forbidding doctors from entering his private chambers while he was sleeping. He believed that physicians were more likely to kill him with their remedies than any actual illness. To ensure his safety, he slept in a room with multiple locked doors and kept a loaded rifle by his bed to fend off anyone coming to check his pulse. It's a strange irony when the most protected man in the country views his own healthcare providers as the greatest threat to his survival. 44. Emperor Paul I of Malta's neighboring territories once banned the use of the word representative in any legal document or speech because he felt it hinted at democracy. He also banned round hats, waistcoats, and cravats, believing these specific items of clothing were secret signals for revolutionaries. His guards were authorized to rip illegal hats off people's heads in the street or tear their waistcoats apart. He essentially tried to fight the Enlightenment by attacking people's wardrobes. If your government banned your favorite hat because it looked too rebellious, would you change your style or your loyalty? 45. King Mongkut of Siam, the man who inspired The King and I, took the concept of holy water to a legally mandated extreme. He passed a law stating that the water used for the royal bath had to be collected from specific points in 5 different rivers at exactly the same time during a lunar eclipse. If the timing was off by even a second, the water was considered unclean, and the officials responsible could be demoted or fined. He turned the king's morning hygiene into a massive nationwide logistical operation involving hundreds of people and precise astronomical calculations. 46. Sultan Moulay Ismail of Morocco was so obsessed with his own lineage that he passed laws regarding the exact behavior of his 500 wives and thousands of concubines. He was famously recorded as the father of over 800 children, and he mandated that any woman in his harem who was suspected of infidelity be punished by having her teeth pulled out. He treated his family like a private army, using fear and extreme legislation to ensure total control over his massive household. It's a dark reminder that for some rulers, family law was just another word for absolute tyranny. 47. King Christian IV of Denmark was so convinced that he was a master architect that he passed laws requiring all new buildings in Copenhagen to follow his own crude sketches. This resulted in several structures that were notoriously difficult to live in, with stairs that led nowhere and windows placed at floor level. Because his vision was law, no professional architect dared to correct his mistakes, fearing they would be accused of insulting the king's genius. Have you ever worked for a boss who was so creative that their ideas actually made it impossible for you to do your job? 48. Queen Christina of Sweden once decided that she was bored with being a woman and a monarch, so she passed a series of decrees to abdicate and then traveled across Europe dressed as a man. While this was progressive, her laws of travel were bizarre. She would take over entire inns and demand they be redecorated to her exact masculine tastes for a single night. She essentially used her former royal status to bypass every social norm of the 17th century, proving that even an ex-monarch can still use the law to be the world's most demanding tourist. 49. King Otto of Bavaria, brother to the fairy tale king, suffered from a mental illness that led him to believe his palace was filled with ghosts. He passed a royal protection law that required a soldier to shoot one of the palace's resident monsters every single morning. To keep the king happy, without actually wasting ammunition or damaging the walls, the guards would fire a blank pistol out a window at 9 a.m. sharp. He essentially mandated a daily execution for a ghost, turning the palace schedule into a ritual of imaginary warfare. All right, we've covered 49 points, and only the final one remains. But before we reveal number 50, it's time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the most mind-numbingly stupid rule goes to King Henry VIII's beard tax. It wins because it turned a natural biological process, growing hair, into a paid government subscription. It's the ultimate example of a ruler finding a way to tax the very hair on a man's face just because he could. Do you agree with our pick? Let us know in the comments below. And now, our final number. 50. Emperor Elagabalus of Rome takes the final spot for a law that sounds like a cruel social experiment. He passed a decree that guests at his lottery-style dinners could win prizes ranging from 10 camels to 10 dead flies. The law of the lottery meant that if you were invited to the palace, you were legally bound to accept your prize, even if it was a box of rotting meat or a jar of angry wasps. He essentially turned the Roman high court into a deadly game of let's make a deal, proving that for some rulers, the law was nothing more than a way to turn human dignity into a punchline. We've just seen how a crown can turn a petty whim into a national disaster. History proves that when absolute power meets zero common sense, the result isn't just tyranny, it's a high-budget comedy. These laws remind us that the people who shaped our world were often just as weird as the rest of us. If you woke up as a monarch tomorrow, what's the first modern invention you'd ban just to see what happens? Let us know in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and stay curious. See you next time.